Dr. Kara Dixon Vuic is the Lance Corporal Benjamin W. Schmidt Professor of War, Conflict, and Society at Texas Christian University. Her research brings together the history of wars and militarization, the history of gender and sexuality, and social and cultural history. At TCU, she teaches courses on war and society and the history of gender and wars. She is also the author of Officer, Nurse, Woman, the Army Nurse Corps in the Vietnam War. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Vuic.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Linda for the invitation to come too. And I'll say that I've only been in Texas for 2.5-ish years, and I quickly discovered that you're not actually from Texas unless you were born on the soil in this state. So it's been an interesting sort of few years of coming to terms with Texas. But it's been amazing, and I'll say too that it's been really fun learning about Fort Worth in World War I. It's not something that I focused on as a graduate student, but it's something that's been really interesting lately to learn about Fort Worth and Camp Bowie, and so anyway. So I want to start today with something that might be a little odd, something perhaps surprising. This was the most interesting newspaper article I came across in looking at women in World War I. So just in case you can't read it very well, it says she'd been out all night with a soldier. Her hair was disheveled and there were crow's feet under her eyes. So she dropped into the lavatory at the Texas and Pacific Depot to do a little camouflaging before going home. Here was a box of paint and there was a can of powder when Mrs. Brooks, the traveler's aid officer, walked in and invited the young woman to go to the Central Police Station. Incidentally, it was Mrs. Brooks' first arrest since she was commissioned a few days ago as a special policewoman. A little shocking. My students were blown away when they saw this. So essentially here we have this young woman caught in a bathroom applying makeup early in the morning, and she is arrested. For what crime? Putting on makeup too early in the morning, presumably in a public place. But I bring this out because it's not what most people probably thought when they came here would be the first thing I mentioned in a talk on women in World War I. It's probably the last thing you might have thought would be on a slide here. But what I hope we can do is sort of talk about why something like this would happen. Why is this woman being arrested? What does this have to do with the war, with Fort Worth, with concerns about women during World War I? I mean, there are a lot of assumptions here, right, about what she has done or what's going on. You know, in our world, this just doesn't make much sense. But the problem was that she did not fit what most people thought women should be in World War I. Right? She did not fit the model. She stood outside of that, and her actions, whatever they were, assumed to be or otherwise, were assumed to be criminal, particularly in a place like Fort Worth because of the presence of Camp Bowie. And Camp Bowie really changes everything for women. So that's why I want to talk about that. What you probably expected was something more along these lines, right? This is much more familiar. American women in World War I take on a variety of roles in the military and civilian roles as volunteers, you know, in all sorts of ways. 23,000 nurses in World War I in the military, in the Army, and the Navy. Many of them go overseas. The military also admits women who are not nurses for the first time in its history. The Navy admits women as yeomen. The Marine Corps admits women to do sonography. The Army admits women and sends them over to run communication lines. They call them hello girls. Women do all sorts of things in the military for the first time. They did not go as female physicians, though there were hundreds of female physicians at the time. But these plucky women nonetheless said, we're going anyway, and they funded their own hospitals and went to war and operated hospitals all over Europe. Women went to the war as recreation workers, like this young woman down here with the donuts. And actually one Fort Worth woman does this as well. I'll talk about her in a little bit. On the home front, they move into factories, right? This is pre-Rosie the Riveter in World War II. These are sort of Rosie's mothers. They move into factories just as Rosie did. They serve in the Women's Land Army, working in farms. They participate in all sorts of ways as volunteers. They raise money, they sell Liberty bonds, they roll bandages, they work in hostess houses. You know, they volunteer their work in lots and lots and lots of ways. And that's the most common way for women to participate, is by volunteering, and especially in Fort Worth. But all women, regardless of who they are or what their roles are in the war, all women find that their lives are disrupted by the war in some way, and that the expectations for them have changed. Sort of what people expect women to be at that time is a bit in flux during the war. And their actions, like the poor girl in the train station, find that they have a significance that they did not have before. They take on an elevated importance in this wartime context. And that could be for good or ill. You know, your work doing something like rolling bandages means much more during wartime. Putting on makeup in the train station a little too early in the morning also means something more in wartime than it did before. So in all sorts of ways, women see their lives disrupted. And to put it all in context, and what I want to do is kind of give you the broad national picture and then insert Fort Worth women into that picture. And I don't want to go too much into history here, but briefly, just to kind of understand what's going on in women's lives, everything is in flux at this time. Sort of public understandings of what women are supposed to be is being debated. Women are moving into more public roles. This is one of the pages of the freshman class at TCU in fall 1917. And you can just see from the pictures how many more women there are than men. And part of that could be because of the war. The draft had gone into effect, but it's not that big of an influence, right? Women are moving into higher education. They're moving into public roles through the suffrage movement. They're moving into the workforce in all sorts of ways. And increasingly, as Europe goes to war, they're involved in peace organizations. That was a huge effort of women, was to keep the country out of war. And all of this really fits sort of the gender ideology of the time, right? What people thought women were to be. And generally, it's that women are supposed to be in the home. They're supposed to be raising children. They're supposed to be more religious, more pious, more moral than men. So men and women have different roles in society. And it doesn't mean that everybody adheres to those roles. You might not actually live up to the ideal, but it means that that's the standard, right, for men and women. They're very different. And all of that works until women start to take that ideology and kind of turn it on its head. And they start to say, well, if we are to be mothers, and if we're to be raising children and be more religious, then we should be involved in politics, right? Because we'll bring our sort of womanly influence to politics. And this kind of argument worked much better for them than the argument they had been making, which was, we're human beings and citizens of this country. Give us the right to vote. That didn't work so well. What worked was to say, we're mothers, we bring voters into the world, we should have a right to vote as well. We should be able to influence things like education, health issues, public health concerns. We should be able to be involved in things like the temperance movement, a sort of moral issue in their minds, social welfare, labor, all of those kinds of things. And so this kind of argument was working, right? Women were gaining the right to vote in some Western states, and they were starting to become more involved in public organizations, right? Progressive era kinds of social organizations, right? Think Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, Settlement House movement, that kind of work. In Fort Worth, the Women's Wednesday Club is a very good example of that, right? That these are women who are saying we should be able to be involved in public roles, and we're going to focus on culture. We're going to focus on the arts, on music, on libraries, this one in particular. We're going to focus in these ways. And that was acceptable to the public because people thought, well, that's women's work, right? And so that was totally fine, even though it put them in a public role, right? So it allowed them to move into places where they hadn't been accepted before. But as the Great War begins in Europe, a majority of Americans of all stripes, but specifically women, opposed any kind of U.S. involvement. And that lasts a long time, right? It takes a lot to get the American public to want to enter what they called Europe's war. And women made that argument of staying out of the war based on this kind of rationale, that we're mothers, right? And so 1915, this is a top 10 hit, believe it or not. We could all sing it if you want, but I don't have the sheet music with me. But I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Right, it's a very personal kind of opposition to war, to soldiering. Nations should arbitrate their troubles. They should negotiate, not fight it out. And if all mothers would just put their foot down, war wouldn't happen. Right? It's kind of optimistic on their part. But this was a top 10 hit, and it in today's culture, maybe it seems a little out of place, particularly mom like holding her grown adult son. But this was what people just thought, well, that makes sense in 1915. So the ideal was women are more peaceful, they're mothers, right, which we don't go to war, and all of that would just be torn to shreds by World War I, right? In part because the U.S. government curtailed all pacifist activities. Right? World War I is, if anything, the greatest example of the American government shutting down civil liberties in this country, across the board in all sorts of ways. But it also kind of fell apart when women go to war. Right? When women go to war, you can't say women are more pacifist than men if they're also out there fighting war in their own ways. So all of that is kind of the background. And it's important to remember, I think, that most women who participate in the war in some way are not mothers, right? They don't join the military because they want to be good mothers, right? You couldn't actually join the military if you were a mother. They didn't allow that. If most of the women who participate see their service as some sort of way to participate in society, right? They believe they're citizens. They believe they have a duty, an obligation to participate. They believe that, like those physicians who fund their own hospitals, that this is their professional obligation, that this is their chance to say, yes, we are physicians just like men, treat us equally. For most women, this is not a chance. They don't rush to the volunteer office and say, I'm a mom, let me do whatever, take my money because I'm a mom. They take their money because they're citizens and they see themselves that way. So why are we talking about mothers if most of these women are not mothers? It's because the nation, the government, the military use motherhood to mobilize the public. Right? They use the idea of motherhood. This was one of the most famous posters of the war, very iconic. You could talk all day long about the symbolism of this poster here. But in literal ways and in figurative ways, the government and the military use women, images of women, of mothers in particular, to shift the American women's support for the war, and then to say, this idea will help us come to terms with the military, with a standing military, with the idea of the United States going to war on another continent, which was a very radical thing for most of the public. Mothers kind of become the symbol of the nation in World War I. So instead of opposing war, government and military officials suggest good patriotic mothers do in fact raise their voice to be soldiers. And actually a couple years after the song came out, somebody revised it into a new song based on the same lyrics that said, I didn't raise my boy to be a slagger. Very different, right? So we have completely altered our understandings of what mothers do now. Military officials are really good at this kind of symbolism too. YMCA clubs, as well as others in the war, sort of use this idea of we're sending home to the boys. We're going to send substitute mothers, substitute sisters, substitute sweethearts to the boys. They're always boys. They're never men. They're always boys. And that will keep the home ties from breaking. Right? We're going to use this idea of home as a way to domesticate the military, make the military seem acceptable to the public. Military even has these sort of mass attempts to get soldiers to write home to mama. And part of the reason Mother's Day was such a big deal was because the military made it that way. On Mother's Day, you had to go into the hut and write your mom. That was not an option. Right? All of these moms getting letters thought their sons were just amazing. Well, right, maybe, but they also were ordered to go home and to go into the YMCA club and write you a letter. Yeah, so there's a whole attempt on the part of the military to cultivate this kind of motherhood ideal. And so in a broad sense, government, military officials, they're all using sort of the image of motherhood to frame public understandings of what all women are to be during the war. All women should, whether they are mothers or not, work to support the war effort. Right? Any kind of volunteer effort, rolling bandages, knitting, selling war bonds, kind of adapted domestic chores for the military. Right? And knitting is a really good example of this. There are a lot of propaganda posters about knitting during the war. And I learned to knit to get myself through my dissertation. It was a therapy, so I like knitting. But the propaganda in World War I kind of made it seem as though if you don't knit enough socks, those boys are going to freeze to death. Right? The propaganda kind of made it seem as though a military of more than 1 million men needed you to knit their socks. No, not really. No, it did not. The military did not outfit its men with hand-knitted socks, right? Just to be clear. And so it's a great example because there's all of this importance placed on it in the imagery, but it actually is not what outfits the military, right? What outfits the military is an industrialized, modern factory system, right? That produces millions of garments. That's what outfits the military. And so you could say that women do outfit the military, but they're working class women in factories working those machines, right? They're not women in the propaganda posters who have the time, the means, the knowledge to knit, right? And so it's an interesting sort of blend of what's going on. And in Fort Worth, women knit. I mean, they knit all over the place. There are songs about knitting. Believe it or not, there are songs about knitting. These women from a local DAR chapter taught people how to knit. The fact of the matter was that a lot of women did not know how to knit, and you can't just pick it up one evening. It takes time. And so a lot of women spend the entire war learning how to knit. Right? So anyway, these women were very proud. They had knitted more garments than any other DAR chapter in the state, and they knitted 470 garments. Wow. Right, great for you guys. Like that's a lot of garments, but that's not going to outfit the military, right? And so it's a good example of sort of how this ideal of domesticity, this idea of mom sitting at home knitting something lovingly for you, that idea meant more than the reality of the work itself, if that sort of makes sense. Same kind of thing with this. Girls growing original in their scrapbook making. They were essentially making these little books for soldiers in hospitals. And again, it's a great thought. It's sort of, gift from home and gift from the heart. But this is the kind of work that gets celebrated because it's an embodiment of women's sort of feminine charms, right? Women caring for you as you recover in the hospital. All right, so whether you're old, young, middle-aged, a mom, not a mom, women come to symbolize the home. And that takes on this elevated importance. The home means domestic happiness. It means this is what you're going to return to, right? If you're telling these soldiers you need to make it through this war so you can return to home. If you're a young man, this is what you're going to create when you go home. Home is what you fight for. Home is what you live for. Home is what you die for. Home means everything in World War I. And so the idea of womanhood has to be protected, right? And it needs to be elevated, sort of put on a pedestal during the war. And a lot of people in Fort Worth and across the nation really feared what the war would do to this idea of women. So the government actually charged the YWCA, the Women's Christian Association, with protecting women. That was their entire purpose in the war. And this is why Mrs. Brooks, in the first article, who arrests the girl in the train station, this is why she has her job, because she is, the YWCA recommended women be hired to be police officers, work in juvenile courts, do all of these things to protect women. All right, and the two particular concerns. One is all of the women coming to the city to work in factories. Right, and the YWCA estimated that Fort Worth had about 1,000 women come and work in factories, which I don't know if that seems like a lot. It wasn't comparatively. It was a smaller number compared to cities like in the Northeast where most of the manufacturing was. But nonetheless, 1,000 women are coming into the city to work. They're operating elevators. They're working as sort of message delivery people. They used to be boys. Now I guess women are doing it. They might be people. They're waiters, they're soda dispensers, they're working in offices, they're working in factories to some extent. But they're moving into all sorts of new jobs. Right? And that was a big concern for Fort Worth women, because what does that mean? It's not an age in which women, single women, move to new cities on their own. Right? This is not an age in which that happens. If you do that, somebody needs to be looking out for you, right, in the mentality of the time period. And so the YWCA set up homes in Fort Worth for these women to live at. They didn't want them out renting on their own. We're going to give them a nice, safe home. We're going to have recreation for them. Everything's going to be managed. It's going to be very wholesome, very clean, right? We're going to look out for these girls. Interestingly enough, the officials also complained about the money that they were paid. And I found this really surprising, actually, that some of the YWCA officials complained that local businessmen, if they replaced a man with a woman worker, they would just slash her wages in half. And that's what happened all the time, but these women were complaining about it openly in the Star-Telegram. And they complained that if you don't pay women, we're actually not going to be able to recruit women into this work. And they kind of made that point. They said some of these women are going to want to continue working after the war. One of them said, once they've had a taste of the independence felt by a woman spending her own money, she's not going to want to go back home. And so I thought that was really interesting that they're kind of pushing this more modern day appeal. At the same time that they're sort of holding on to the women must be protected kind of idea. It's a little bit of everything there. But the second fear is that women, and especially young girls, are going to be overcome with what they call khaki fever. Almost as if it were an illness that you could like treat with Tylenol. Khaki fever. And they actually, this is something that was not just in Fort Worth or even in the United States. They talk about it in Europe as well. That sort of women just would not be able to control themselves around a uniform. It's not a very encouraging picture of women, but they're just fainting away at uniforms. But a War Department official visiting Fort Worth said brass buttons seem to have a sentiment attached to them and attract the girls. The younger girls, those of 14 and 15, should not be allowed to meet soldiers without good chaperones. Party advice. The Star-Telegram also ran, oh wait, I missed that, sorry. There's the recreation. Here we go. They ran a number of articles encouraging good behavior on the part of women. This was another favorite of my students. Spooning, flirting, attending dance halls, overdressing, forbidden for young girls. It seems so silly now, right? I mean, in some ways it seems silly, in some ways it's very sad. I'm not torn. I don't know what to think of this, but some helpful hints: don't spoon in picture shows. It's a little like cuddling too close, basically, right? Sort of good. I need some young people to pranks like this, but that's kind of what that means. They're snuggling a little too close. Don't flirt on the streets. Don't overdress and flirt too. Don't attend dance halls if you're not 18. Don't frequent cabarets if you're not 21. And don't get rebellious if you're called down by the woman probation officer. So there are women whose job is to patrol the streets of Fort Worth and monitor young girls' behavior. And one of these women, Mrs. Ollie V. Hargrave, was asked by a reporter how she decided where that line was, right? What's acceptable behavior, what's not. And she said, if you're a little overdressed or gaudy, that's okay. And it would be interesting to know what being overdressed actually looked like. But she said, if you're overdressed, that's okay. But if you're overdressed and you're going down the street making goo-goo eyes and looking back, I guess like over her shoulder, basically if you're flirting, then she's going to come down and stop you and tell you if you don't behave yourself, she can arrest you.
Well.
Right? Now, this seems absurd. The country would be up in arms if we arrested girls who flirt today. Not to mention boys, because that's a whole other subject, right? But in wartime, it becomes a significant issue. And it's not, I mean, we might laugh about it today, but it's not something they laughed about at the time. And that's what I think is really interesting, is that this becomes a huge concern on the part of government officials. And in part it's about women's behavior, right? But it's also about men. Because if you go back to what they thought women were supposed to be, they're supposed to be more religious, they're supposed to be more moral. And so women who overdress and flirt aren't adhering to that ideal, right? But they're also not sort of encouraging men to walk the straight and narrow either, right? So it's about them, but it's also about what they might be doing to men. And it's interesting in this time period, men are always boys, and they're always being led astray by the women. They never lead themselves astray. They're always being led astray. They have no control over themselves, poor men. A YMCA official came to Fort Worth. It's Dr. Mabel Ulrich. She toured the nation giving speeches, and she came to Fort Worth, and she said that this famous poster, Uncle Sam pointing his finger, was also pointed at young women in Fort Worth. And she said, if you are not doing your womanly part by your dress, your conduct, your influence to make Fort Worth a moral, cultured place in the time of this great crisis, when 30,000 men are here being trained how to defend their lives, then you are a slacker. And Uncle Sam's eyes hold just accusation for you. No pressure. Right? No pressure, ladies. Behave yourselves. And so it's all of that means a lot more because of the draft, right? This is also a time when Americans are rethinking their ideas of what the military means. And it's such a foreign concept to us today, because today I think most Americans think the military is this honorable institution. You send boys to become men, right? Get some discipline, become men, become leaders in the community. It's an honorable thing. That was not the case on the eve of World War I, at all, at all. Most Americans thought enlisted soldiers, not officers, officers were a little different, but enlisted soldiers, they thought they were sort of hardscrabble men, they did dirty work, and whatever trouble they got into, that was fine, because they deserved a little bit of fun, right? And so all of that really kind of blew up in 1916 when they sent the military to the Mexican border. And reports start to come out that when they're not chasing Pancho Villa, they're getting into a little bit of trouble with the saloons and the brothels. And reports come out that almost one third of the soldiers had venereal disease, and that caused some eyebrows to raise, to put it mildly. Religious officials were really shocked and angered, and social welfare groups were concerned. But again, most Americans didn't really think about it, because that wasn't your boy, right? But when the draft comes into play and your boy might be drafted, now all of a sudden you care a whole lot about what goes on in military camps, right? Now it matters. And so Americans start to pay a whole lot of attention to what's happening in military training camps, what's happening in the military environment, what kinds of things are people exposed to. Not to mention that your son might be drafted and go to France, which in this World War I era is seen as sort of this land of debauchery and just evilness, particularly Paris. Like, we're not just going to draft your boy and expose him to saloons and evil women. We're going to send him to Paris. Right? What are you doing with our boys? And so to get the American public behind the idea of a draft, which also occurs in peacetime, remember, a standing peacetime draft, part of the way which they get the public behind it is to say, we'll take care of your boy. He's still a boy. We'll take care of your boy. Right? We're going to start this whole campaign focused on education, on recreation, anti-vice programs. We're going to do everything we can possibly do for your boy. And he's going to come out of that war a better man. Right? And so it's a very new idea of what Americans think of the military. And women are key to that in all sorts of ways, especially in places like Fort Worth where you get Camp Bowie, right? Fort Worth businessmen had really wanted Camp Bowie to come to town because they knew it would bring a lot of profit, and it did. But it also brought 30,000 men to a city that was about 3 times that size. So I don't know what the population of Fort Worth is today, but take a third of it and add it, like overnight. Here you go. There's 30,000 more men. And that meant some trouble, and the big concern was vice, which in Fort Worth was right down the road at Hell's Half Acre. Right? And so the concern about vice is alcohol and prostitution, and the two often go hand in hand in a lot of these folks' minds. And so the focus on vice involved shutting down prostitution, all of these sort of brothels, the little houses, cribs, house prostitutes, all over the place, right? This is what becomes the big concern in Fort Worth. And they know, the government has made it clear, you can't get a training camp in your town if you don't shut down your vice district, if you don't shut down the red light district. The government would pull the training camp from you. So it becomes a citywide effort to shut this down. So this Fort Worth Star-Telegram on March 5th, 1917 says that they're going to shut down the district. And initially the rhetoric is sort of that women will be notified of the change, they'll be given a chance to go back home, we'll help them obtain work if they want, we're going to try to reform women who want to be reformed. The next day the mayor even says that there are no plans to arrest women. The focus is going to be on the landlords. It's going to be on the people who own the brothels. They're going to go after them. And the initial thought was, if we go after the landlord, then the women will have no option and they'll just leave, basically. But the mayor initially said, prostitutes are no worse than lots of boys. They are still good girls who have sown their wild oats. I think they deserve another chance. Which is a very sort of optimistic idea. And they actually began penalizing men who were caught in public places with prostitutes. That hadn't happened before. Anytime there was a crime committed, it was the prostitute who committed the crime, not the man who actually hired her for these services. In World War I, the city says, no, we're gonna find men. Now, notice it's for being caught in public with them. It's not actually for the deed itself. That's not the crime. It's just being seen in public with prostitutes, which is an interesting difference. Fine no more than $200, but that's maybe you could see it as sort of a baby step of equalizing the punishments here. But by October, some very optimistic city officials declared that the city was morally clean and almost depopulated of the immoral woman class. Almost. Very optimistic officials. It only took 7 months, they said. Bless their hearts, as they say in the South. They're very optimistic. But the problem, and they shut down a number of brothels, right? That's fact. But the problem was that in shutting down the brothels, it did not shut down prostitution, right? All it did was disperse the issue, right? Whereas before it was, generally speaking, in brothels in Hell's Half Acre, now all of a sudden it's everywhere. And so now you've got to shift your focus, and they give up on the idea that we're not going to arrest women. Now they actually go after the women, and they start arresting women en masse. The women are finding ways to meet demands that have increased by about 30,000. And so they're all over the city now. One big concern of the city too was that they were traveling by car, that you would have essentially taxi drivers transporting women around town. And so they introduced a law, and this actually came from the War Department, so this isn't even just specific to Fort Worth, but it's a War Department issue, that drivers of automobiles that transport underworld women, sounds like a comic book character, underworld women, for immoral purposes within 10 miles of a military camp could face $1,000 fine and a year in prison. So it's on par with what women were fined, right? It's not the piddly $200 fine for being caught in public anymore. So one of the police commissioners actually introduced a bill that would shut down all taxi stands, that you couldn't just have a stand of taxis because they were afraid that women would congregate there, take the taxi to the camp, to the border of the city, whatever. Now it's like their problem has just grown. They don't know where to focus it. They're still trying, but they're not all that successful. Among the most ironic things, however, was this article that a woman saw her vagrancy charge. Vagrancy is a euphemism for prostitution often. She just bought a Liberty Bond, and she was let off, basically. And this was suggested as an option by the assistant county attorney. Said, if you buy a Liberty Bond, I'll just forget about your charges. One of my students pointed out she bought the Liberty Bond with the money she had made from prostitution. Ironic in a small way, but that kind of thing. I mean, it's just weird. But anyway, so that's sort of one approach to the vice issue in Fort Worth. The other is, and this goes hand in hand, is that you can't just shut down the problem. You've got to give a healthy alternative. Right, you've got to create some alternatives for these men. And so the Recreation Commissioner from the War Department came to Fort Worth in July of 1917, right when all of this is sort of starting to come together, and he said there are two phases of work, one of repression, which is what they were doing with the vice districts, and one of construction. Right, and so all of the religious organizations, social welfare organizations, women's clubs, all over the city start to offer sort of programs, amusements, diversions, anything they can do that would be seen as an alternative. And they come up with a lot. And this is just sort of 1 week of options, things to do. You've got a lot of the churches on Sunday offering, sort of opening up services, but for the rest of the week, an evening with Camp Bowie soldiers, you could go and have a cookie and meet girls, sort of the chaperoned environment. One of the churches had a swimming pool. I forget which one, but one of them had a swimming pool, and they frequently opened up the swimming pool to the soldiers. But it's, this is pretty typical, right? We'll offer anything we can do as a diversion. But the favorite diversion was anything that involved women, right? There was a Reverend H.S. Brooks, who was a secretary at a YMCA hut at Camp Bowie. And he said, the men have wives, sisters, and sweethearts who entertain them at home. It's mighty hard to content them with just plain men stunts. They kept trying to have these talent shows where the guys would entertain themselves, and it didn't work the same way. Even the Reverend is like, no, we really actually need women to come. And so the YWCA, which was staffed largely by the Fort Worth Women's Wednesday Club, began to provide clubs for soldiers to meet their families. If they were married officers, then their wives, their children could visit, and they would have this place to go, as opposed to just trying to find a hotel in the city or something like that. But it was also a place for soldiers, young soldiers, to meet women, again, in this chaperoned, sort of wholesome environment. They do this work overseas. The YMCA sends about 3,500 women to France to operate canteens where they do essentially the same thing, as well as the Salvation Army. There was a woman from Fort Worth who the article only calls Mother Burdick. She never has a first name in the article, which is interesting. She went with her husband Floyd and their daughter to France, and they essentially made donuts for soldiers, donuts and pies in these little huts. And so soldiers could come in, talk with people from home. Primarily women were the ones making the food. And again, I think, mother makes you food. This is all sort of familial home comforts. Come in there, have some contact with home. And the article here says she treats the boys good and bad, rough and gentle, with the same tenderness she would show as if they were her own. And they would, for their part, the men, would go through a barrage any time to do a favor for her. She's a picture of back home domesticity. Right, it's a very comforting image, right? If you're a mom and your son is drafted and in France, this is what you want to read, right? That your boy is eating donuts with Mother Burdick from Fort Worth. That is exactly what you want to know, right? You do not want to know anything else he could possibly be doing in France. Not at all, right? And so again, part of the comforting the American public about the military, about the war, involves women. But you can imagine that involving women in these ways is very complicated, right? Another reverend working at a YMCA in Fort Worth said that women make the camp too much like the Garden of Eden. It's a fine line we're trying to walk here, right? Recreation Commissioner visiting Fort Worth in July 1917, he said, "The woman problem is our greatest. It seems dangerous for them to meet women, and it is dangerous for them not to meet women." Right? Women are the problem and the solution, right? Many of the soldiers would like to talk with women they can talk with easily. A bit of a coded language there. But that's the kind we wish to prevent them from talking with. They must meet and talk with women, and it is best for them. Right, so you're trying to do two things here at once. And so the recommendation is that they meet proper women, right? Now this is not a Fort Worth woman, she's actually from New Jersey, but I love this picture because it really shows you what the problem is, right? Your job, if you are a Fort Worth woman coming to the YWCA hut at Camp Bowie, is essentially to be sweet and friendly. Right? Make these boys feel at home, make them feel comforted, feel relaxed, but don't be too outgoing. Right? Women aren't supposed to talk to men first in 1917. Right? You're supposed to make them feel like they can become attached to you, but you don't want them to become romantically attached to you. Right? So how do you balance this? Especially in 1917 when the rules were very strict, right, as we've seen. How is a woman like Emma supposed to balance? These guys follow her around all the time. They're always showing up, they're proposing marriage, and she's supposed to make them feel good about life, but not cross this line in the sand that nobody quite knows where it is exactly, right? That's difficult. And so the YWCA in Fort Worth, they said, they wanted Fort Worth girls to meet the soldiers at Camp Bowie and entertain them and make a fuss over them. These boys are prepared to go to a foreign land to fight for our homes and liberties, and the girls must assist in contributing to their social enjoyment. Right? That's not like, please do this in your spare time. This means a lot. This is important work. But they also say there should be no mistaking the purpose of this work. There is no desire and no effort to put the girls in moral straitjackets. Nobody is going to try to make prissy, Quaker-like killjoys, odd phrase, out of the Fort Worth girls. It couldn't be done to begin with, and it would serve no good purpose if it could be done. Right? That's a blurry line there. And so it goes on and says, this is not a trivial matter, as some may suppose, nor is it a crusade to convert the soldiers and the girls into plaster saints. It is simply a sensible movement to deal with one of the many extraordinary conditions created by the war. The War Department is looking to the patriotic cooperation of all girls in this matter. To fail is to be a slacker, and we must have no slackers among them. Right? Amazing. We're not just asking you to show up at Camp Bowie once in a while and serve cookies. This means something. The general in charge of Camp Bowie, General Griebel, he said that the rest homes, or the YWCA homes where the men can meet their young women friends under proper environments, is a great thing. If our men have desirable acquaintances, it will help them to do what is expected of them. They will stop and say, now what would Sarah Jane think about that? Right, sure, right. Sure they will. You tell yourself that, General Griebel. But this matters. They sort of elevate socializing, essentially, which is what most Fort Worth women involved in the war did. They elevate socializing to national importance, to military matters, right? We need our boys to have Sarah Janes at home to think about when they go to France. It'll make them better soldiers. The YWCA worker, Ulrich, who I quoted a minute ago, she said that every woman here is called to back up the men who are going to France and to show them you are worth dying for or living for. Right? So the image of women becomes this matter of national significance. Right? So what does it all mean? Right? If we go back to, and there's some proper young ladies, I suppose. This was the TCU YWCA cabinet. So these are some of the women who would have been volunteering at the hostess house. This is what we're looking for. There we go. So if you think about what it all means, right? We go back to the woman putting on makeup, right? She's not one of these women who gets celebrated in wartime propaganda, right? She's not the poster girl of World War I. Right, the poster girl of World War I is the mother, right, and the Red Cross poster. But I think the poor girl on the train station in Fort Worth tells us actually a lot about what people were concerned about women in World War I. She probably didn't feel that way when she was arrested, but I think her experiences can tell us a whole lot. And in the first place, like I said, the government and the military, they're using women to marshal the public's support for the war, right? If we can get women behind the war, everybody else will follow. And it creates a reassuring image for families. We're taking your boys, we're sending them to war, but don't worry, we're going to take care of them, we're going to send home to them, and they'll come back better men. And all of this will all be fine. But keep in mind, this is a particular kind of woman, right? The TCU girls here, where did they go? There they are. It's a particular kind of woman, right? Nowhere in this have you seen an image of an African-American woman, a Latina woman, a working class woman, anything other than white, middle, and upper class women. Those are the ones that were celebrated. The women who have the time to knit at home, not the ones that have to go work in the factories. Right? It's a particular kind of woman that gets celebrated. The ones who can volunteer, right? Volunteering is in many ways a luxury. You have the time, you have the money to volunteer. So World War I is not a war for all women, right? It might be a war for all women, but they're not all celebrated in the same way. Some are celebrated, others are denigrated. But it's also interesting that they're, in this time period, their government and military, they're taking what is generally accepted as women's work, this domestic, sort of home-centered work, what we think women are supposed to be, and it becomes more important in World War I. It doesn't sort of overtly challenge anybody's ideas of what women are supposed to be, even though it relocates that work a little bit, gives it a greater meaning. It doesn't challenge sort of popular notions of what's respectable for women. And it kind of takes that idea and moves it forward a little bit. Even though it's still a very confined and regulated image, it kind of moves that forward a little bit. So after the war, right, remember this is the suffrage era. Women don't vote in World War I everywhere. But after the war, women began to make this kind of argument, right? We've done all of these things. Right? Okay, we've done all of this work, but we've also volunteered. We've done all of this work that you have said was important. How are you going to deny us the right to vote now? Right? And that's the argument that works for Woodrow Wilson, who vehemently opposed women's voting before the war. He was not too subtle about it. Wilson did not favor women's right to vote. But during the war, that kind of argument becomes harder to ignore, right? How are you going to say women can't vote if they've now participated in the war in all of the ways you told them to do so? Right? It's harder to deny that. So it has lasting consequences. Even those, all of these women in Fort Worth, most of whom are volunteering, some of whom are being arrested. All of that mattered a great deal in World War I, takes on kind of elevated significance for the country, for Fort Worth as a city, and leaves a legacy, I think, for World War II, that once war comes again, they'll kind of pick up where they left off. And things will change, some things will stay the same, some things will change a little bit, but it's an interesting story, so. You guys have questions? I'm happy to answer questions.
Who published that poster about all the list of things women have done and what they want to know?
The last one, let me see if I, women's suffrage, I just hit the button one too many times. Women's Suffrage Publishing Company, I believe. And yeah, I can look it up, the non-blurry version of that. But it's essentially by this point, the women's suffrage organizations are kind of making the same point now. So the National Women's Party, the women out in front of the White House picketing, they're making this argument all along. But the National American Women's Suffrage Association has kind of come around as well. They kind of unify at the end. And in part, again, because they know it's working. Some women's suffrage groups actually did not like this argument. They said, I should have the right to vote whether I support the war or not because I'm a citizen. I pay taxes in this country. My support of the war. Men don't get their right to vote because they fight in a war. I shouldn't have to either. A lot of them actually hated this argument, but they were also practical. And they knew that this is what worked. It was kind of the same thing as the maternal politics. This is what's going to work for us. As long as we fit their ideas of what we should be, and we get the right to vote, then great. Then we'll do with it what we will. Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, sexual mores had a lot to do with this. What I'm wondering about, since you've done so much research in this period, and because by the 20s you were seeing some support for birth control, which relates to women's growth. What was happening in terms of birth control during World War I?
In the American military, not a lot.
Yeah.
The concern was primarily disease, and this was an argument.
Birth rates.
Right, they weren't concerned with birth rates, particularly because they were going to be French women who were pregnant. Right, that was not our problem. Our problem. This doesn't make the military leaders look all that outstanding, but this was their approach. These are people, Pershing, for example, who commanded the forces when he was on the Mexican border, opened up military-regulated brothels and said, boys, if you're going to go here, this is where you go. We send these women to doctors, we make sure they don't have disease. These are the brothels that are approved for your use. Pershing did that. Go Pershing. On the way to France, literally on the boat, on the way to France, a urologist with the American Army essentially embraces scare tactics and shows him all of these images of venereal disease, grosses him out, essentially, and by the time they get to France, Pershing's like, we're having none of it. Nobody's doing anything. And so if you got a venereal disease, you were docked your pay, you were kept from your unit, and you were shamed. And there are all sorts of posters about that. You're a slacker if you get disease. If at the end of the war you were still sick, your unit would go home without you. You had to stay in France until you got better. And so then when you came home, everybody knew why you were still in France. So they're not concerned with birth control in that sense. What they're concerned with is venereal disease. And the military was, sorry this has turned gross all of a sudden, but the military figured out better ways to treat the problem, but they weren't doing a whole lot other than the sort of PR campaign to prevent the problem. The Germans were, and all sorts of other armies were, even the Brits by the end of the war were passing out condoms, but the American military did not. They did in World War II. It is a radically different situation. They're passing out condoms, they're regulating brothels, they're doing all sorts of things. But in World War I, it's a kind of an aberration. Yeah.
Well, here
Sorry.
locally, we did have expansion in terms of like the women's cooperative home that became the all-church home. When it was the cooperative home, mother and children could reside there together.
Mhm.
And we had an increase not only of soldiers' wives, but of women who were having children by soldiers but were not married.
Yeah.
And we also had a little bit of increase, I think, in some of the homes that were working with what then were called unwed mothers.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is what they're concerned about. They're, even with the vice, shutting down Hell's Half Acre doesn't address the central problem that they're focused on. But it's easier for them to focus on a certain, what was it called, like the class of undesirable or underworld women or whatever. That was an easy target.
Yes.
Addressing the broader issues were not so easy. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to say that there's some other interesting local history. I'm a student at Texas Wesleyan, and this was huge in changing Texas Wesleyan from initially being Texas Woman's College to, by the mid-20s, being Texas Wesleyan College, because it had expanded the role of women from students at Wesleyan just being a place where good daughters of Methodist ministers got sent to be protected from the troubles of the world, to having the university call them to do social interaction with these soldiers and volunteerism that later helped Wesleyan decide to become a co-educational institution, because it was then seen, oh, I guess it is okay for young men and young women to be spending time together in these particular social situations.
There's a terrific book, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's available in the Texas Wesleyan bookstore.
Dr. Brenda Matthews
Yeah.
and Dr. Alexander.
It's a great history on that connection.
Oh, that's really interesting. Huh. Proper young ladies. Huh. I did not know that.
It also made for the folding of the medical department at TCU.
Mhm.
They had purchased equipment and had some professors when Fort Worth University, which was the first Texas Wesleyan, and then became Fort Worth University, they just changed their name. When they moved in 1910 to Oklahoma City, and the medical school was still up there, TCU had just moved back here, and they opened a medical school. But what happened is all these students were volunteering or drafted that were in the medical school, and some a lot of the professors. So they ended up selling it to Bailey.
See, you're not a native Texan unless you've been here. I need to be here longer to learn all the things.
Yeah, so the medical school they're talking about at TCU is not a new thing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Huh. Yeah.
When was the drought started? Was it just before the war? Was there a peacetime drought in 1913, 1914?
No, it was before the war, and I think April of 17 is when Wilson asked for war, and the draft had come in several months before that. So it was the first peacetime draft in American history. Obviously, for the war, it's inching closer and closer and closer, and Wilson had essentially convinced the public that this is part of what we have to do, we have to be ready. But it was a peacetime draft, and it's the first draft after the Civil War, and the Civil War draft in both the Union and Confederacy had been so controversial, there's people buying their way out and all sorts of things, that the public did not generally support the draft. It involved a lot of convincing the public that this will be okay. And it quickly goes away as soon as the war's over. We do away with the draft. We don't get another draft until right before World War II. And then the Cold War from 1947 is after World War I is the next time we have a peacetime standing military. So standing military was fairly rare until the Cold War in American history. But yeah, it was really, and we just sort of forget that somehow, in the public, that it was so controversial, but the public was not behind that. So, and this is just one part of that effort to convince them that it's okay, and this is your duty as a citizen. There are all sorts of, the Uncle Sam poster, all those recruitment ads are part of convincing the public this is okay, it's not a violation of your rights, which is what people said. Yeah. Yeah, one more.
Were any American women sent to Europe? I mean, in large number, nurses or?
Nurses,
very,
yeah.
Very many go to anywhere in Europe, not
Oh,
just
yeah.
France.
The most common way to go to Europe was as a nurse. And that was acceptable for the public because they were nurses, right? That was not, beyond anybody's scope of imagination. Some of the women who joined the military, in the Army in particular, the Hello Girls operating telegraph lines, they were some of the first women outside of nurses to go. And then the women in the YMCA clubs, the Salvation Army, those are women who went to the war and they're on the battle. They're not in the trenches, right? They're not in no man's land, but they're not too far removed from that. And so a lot of them come home with stories that, quite frankly, were a lot like men's stories because most men weren't in combat either. So they're having experiences similar to what men did. And that really made people think about the experience of wars as women. That they're experiencing essentially what men did. Not the men in the trenches, but everybody else. Yeah.
Which of these groups do you think were the kind of the early group that may have transitioned into the women that traveled with the USO in World War II?
Yeah, it's the YMCA and the
Okay.
Salvation Army. They're operating the huts, and they're called huts, but they're essentially little clubs. That's essentially what becomes the USO.
Okay.
The USO is formed in World War II by all of these organizations, the YMCA, YWCA, the Jewish Welfare Board, Pop Quiz, the Knights of Columbus, the Travelers Aid Association, and the Salvation Army. This is my next project. That's why I have a list in my head. But they form the USO, and it's the same idea largely, that we've got to send women to these war zones because if we don't, the boys are going to get in trouble. We got to send home, we got to keep them out of trouble, and we've got to send reminders of home. And in World War II, that meant a lot more in the sense that it's a longer war. We're sending them to theaters in non-Western environments, which adds a whole other level of complexity for the military and the segregated time and all of that. But and they continue it through Korea, Vietnam, today, to some extent. Yeah, this is the beginning of that. Well, I hope you got something. It wasn't probably what you expected. There's a little more prostitution involved probably than what you expected. But in Fort Worth, you can't really ignore that.
We knew
World War
about
I. No, it Well, thanks for coming. Thank you.
Before you go, I would like to remind you that tomorrow at 1 p.m. we will be having Hollis Weiner. She will be presenting Monuments and Memory. Exposed to wind, rain, and sun, many World War I monuments have faded and deteriorated over the past century. Hear the history of the marble honor roll of the Jewish doughboys that has been restored and brought back to visibility in Fort Worth. So thank you. Hope to see you tomorrow.